Hi there. In the course now, we're having a deep dive into some of the classic texts and ideas that are still being referred to today in discussions on strategy in contemporary world, which is a really interesting point. You would think that there's something kind of uniquely different about our day and age. So perhaps some of the kind of thinkings about historical texts and lessons learned might not necessarily be relevant. And you might have already heard the phrase, this is year 2025 or 2000s, these things shouldn't happen now. But there's a continuum about human interactions that tends to be quite consistent. And I think in nowhere but in actual war and violence, you see this question. Clausewitz, which you will read more next week or the next session that you're looking into his text, often speaks about the character versus nature of war. Character of war is natural war for Clausewitz, and we'll delve into it more next week, is about bending the will of your adversary to accept your will for a political outcome. So war is policy by other means, according to Clausewitz. And that aspect of it, which is the use and threat of use of violence, in war as a policy aim to achieve something, either to defend yourself or to seize something, or there's a political idea that is always present. And you can think about it, across human history. Wars have always been fought for similar reasons, either for the vanity or the glory of a particular community or a leader, or seizing of assets and resources, or in self-defense, or ambition to kind of establish an empire and major power, and again for resources and for dominance and identity and etc. And that aspect of it, which is how human violence is deployed or threatened, natural war, according to Clausewitz, remains same. And I tend to agree. There's an aspect of war and thinking about conflict that actually is same across history and across the world. But then there's a character a war which changes, which is when tanks are used versus when horses are used, or when archery is used, or catapults are used versus supersonic missiles, or nuclear weapons versus cannons, right? So that character of warfare in today's cyber warfare, information warfare, technologies that we use are different than other eras, right? So we have in today's conflicts, we have a higher speed of delivery of these crucial weapons, higher speed of information, assets that can go all around the world, and weapons that can kill a lot more people than it was possible historically. So that character changes. It poses new questions, new challenges, but the natural war still remains. And this is a really important aspect of thinking about strategy related text across history, right? Even though the character of diplomatic challenges, the character of global conflicts in international relations have evolved, there is an aspect of it which is still pretty much the same, even in the latest developments on tariffs coming out of the United States towards the rest of the world, or Chinese ambitions to establish the South China Sea as their own sole kind of area of influence and take control of Hong Kong increasingly already, and then potentially next Taiwan. Again, those are not by their nature new developments in human history. We have always seen superpowers or leaders behaving this way, but character or what is possible and how it's pursued has changed. So that's why when you think about a concept like strategy, you find yourself often starting with those classic texts or examples in history, which I often find to be kind of limited and reduced to few key texts that are available. But actually, if you think about historically in history, even in biblically, I mean, if you read your Old Testament, if you're Christian, or your Talmud, if you're Jewish, you can see a lot of strategy that is developed by kings and rulers, and an action that is decided to reach a particular outcome. So his strategy has existed across human history, even though the word itself, or how we utilize it and how we talk about it and how we democratize it. In other words, how we assume that every level of individual almost needs to have their own personal strategy, or organizationally, all aspects of the organization needs to have a strategy. But it has actually always been practiced, right? From time eternal. So that's why it really matters, and you could actually see its traces even in Bhagavad Gita, even in other religious texts that capture war and leadership and conflict. Perhaps two remains to be quite frequently utilized in contemporary reflections on strategy. One is Sun Tzu's Art of War, which is in your readings, accessible, profoundly written, poetically communicated. And it is a fascinating study of war and leadership in a war context that is actually more in today's terms about deterrence and foreign policy posture, if you like, not necessarily merely a tactical level of thinking about war fighting, which is how do you deploy your forces, even though logistics and some aspects of it are still there. But what Sun Tzu have kind of communicated out of his own Taoist worldview, understanding of the being, and the kind of philosophy that underwrites a Taoist leader's approach to balancing the universe and the leadership focus, and control of all heavens under earth under the emperor, is actually a few insights that I still think it's highly valuable. One of them is Sun Tzu's kind of understanding of the aspect of power and its use, and when to use it, right? So according to Sun Tzu, you don't really reveal your strengths right away. You don't really use them right away. In fact, the more you use them, the more you have to use them, the less powerful you become, the less effective they become. Ultimately, you shield them, and ultimately, rather than merely just focusing on how to deploy them, and use them tactically, you focus on the enemy. So that's why Sun Tzu's kind of language that says know yourself and know your enemy, which is still being used, is a really important lesson on you not only need to understand yourself in this picture, who am I, what are my strengths and weaknesses, and how do I fight and how do I lead, but you also need to understand your adversary, right? Your opponent. What is their culture? What is their value system? How are they formed? What are their strengths and weaknesses? What are they able to do? What are they not able to do? And for Sun Tzu, the biggest aspect of war fighting is actually before the actual fight itself, which is how can you interrupt your proponent, the way that they think, the way that they organize, in such a way that you are, before you even fight, you are limiting their options, you're weakening them, you're interrupting them, you are making their fight almost impossible. And so by the time you act on the right moment to show your power, which you didn't necessarily just go in and assert right away, then it's almost like a certain victory. And it's almost like your victory or your strategic genius is so boring and so dull, and it really didn't have a wow like a big kind of fight and battle. In fact, the less you lost in that process, and the more decisive it is, the more successful you are as a strategist. So, because by the time you really do the last act, that you deny your opponent any space, your victory is almost certain. So you don't really take a high risk when you know you will lose. You literally shape the context, shape your adversary, shape its own thinking and assumptions and structures in such a way that by the time you act, do that kind of final move, all the pieces come together, and your victory is basically quite simple. And actually, it comes across as dull, and you didn't really lose people, you didn't lose assets, and it's not merely a battle victory, like a limited fight within a larger war. That victory itself is decisive, right? So it isn't like a temporary success enabled by an excessive use of force. In fact, it's final. And so you're bringing order into your domain. And I think those insights from Sun Tzu about the knowledge of your adversary, withholding of force and using it in the right time, and shaping the context of what your adversaries can do, cannot do, interrupting their perceptions of you, hiding kind of your own strengths from them, and using it in a moment when it is just too late for anybody to even act on it, and it becomes so obvious that this has happened, and it doesn't seem as a major thing. You still can see traces of that thinking in particular states and how they conduct foreign policy. I mean, I think there is an aspect of Chinese foreign policy towards Taiwan at the moment that is quite kind of driven by a very similar thinking to Sun Tzu, which is, you position yourself, you build islands across South China Sea, you maneuver militarily, diplomatically, economically in such a way that gradually, bit by bit, you are tightening the circle around Taiwan, and you are taking over it without necessarily a major fight breaking or an invasion. And by the time you do that final step in to take political control of the countries like US and others who might want to come into Taiwan's help and might want to prevent you see it as a fait accompli, right? It has happened. So it's actually too late, and they can't acclimatize to it, and you really didn't lose much money or manpower in terms of a fight and human loss at that stage as well too. So it's fascinating how you could actually see Sun Tzu's worldview and philosophy and still having a lot of applications, even though the character of today's diplomacy or today's businesses or today's warfares have evolved. Those kind of key insights from Sun Tzu could still basically apply to today's world. Thucydides is another one. As you read, you will see his history of the pleniposition. I can never say that word. His history of the war between Athens and Sparta in today's Mediterranean and thousands of years ago was actually one of the first attempts to capture history as a profession and kind of professional reading of a recent event. That's quite well worth to read it on its own. It's got a lot of nuggets of wisdom, on history, but also this dynamic between two powers, one established power, one an emerging city state that also are competing with each other. One wants to protect its position and the other wants to take over, but eventually it kind of bumps into a stalemate where there is no kind of clarity. And then the space of alliances where the weaker one wants more alliances to be able to and maximize their power and enable deterrence and achievement. It's really a fascinating one. And you will see Thucydides being cited these days, particularly in the United States, towards kind of understanding a potential tension between US and China. You hear this language of Thucydides trap that is being used as a way of saying, well, look, in what Thucydides captured in history was emerging power and an established power inevitably goes head to head, and inevitably, basically, there is a conflict between the two. Obviously, the problem is there are so many cases in history where it doesn't happen, right? Not every emerging regional or larger power necessarily contradicts with the other, or maybe the victory or stalemate comes that way. So I don't think we are doomed in any shape or form to a trap, as he called it, as it's called, to Thucydides trap. And I think that's quite a kind of wrong way of evoking a historical study that isn't really setting itself up to be a manual for or for today's or tomorrow's kind of conflicts and on observations on conflict patterns. But it's worth reading. And again, its use kind of highlights that sometimes some of these historical insights and textbooks could offer us false certainties, right? If it looks ancient, right, is it always wiser? Is everybody who lived before us had more wisdom than us if it was written in another language and involved men wearing robes and Greek columns? Are they more wiser than, a scholar today that might be wearing a shirt and a jacket, etc.? Well, sometimes it's not true. Sometimes, and actually, by virtue of the fact that we had way larger access to information than them, we have way larger case studies to look at, a lot more chances of interaction with others that are not like us. We have tools that can translate other languages immediately. So there's a lot that we actually benefit from today in thinking about strategy than the traditional thinkers about strategy. But yet at the same time, some of their insights endure. And that enduring aspect of thinking about leadership kind of stays across history, right? You can see how in different contexts it might appeal. Niccolo Machiavelli, for example, his study of the prince about leadership and about management. We use that in language. We say, well, it's such a Machiavellian way of doing something, which is basically us saying, well, you are really immoral. You see no problem in burning down people around you to keep yourself in power. And you're raising basically this political perspective where the ruler needs to cunningly use any means necessary whatsoever to achieve a desired outcome. And that could include very well do things which are not necessarily seen to be moral, but tough decisions have to be taken. So if you take that merely, Niccolo Machiavelli's kind of um, horizon and apply it to today, and you can see, well, yes, there are politicians and leaders, business leaders, who in policy and government in private sector apply that kind of a thinking, right? That actually in order to reach to this aim of success, then any means is available to you in any ways basically you can pursue is justified, right? Because the end justifies the means. But for us, it's a bit more different, right? So there are legal limitations, thankfully. You can't really choose every mean available to you as a business, as a policymaker, as a government, as a foreign ministry. So there are limitations morally because, in particular in democracies, you are accountable, you're responsible. There is the international media, there's visibility of your actions, international NGOs, international pressure, one way or another, is felt, has been felt. And so that kind of shapes the context, right? But it also shows how brutal some of the strategies that are being pursued could be. Across foreign policy decisions of different states, across how they respond to challenges of terrorism or how they respond to geopolitics, and how they respond to work with non-state and non-state actors in different parts of the world to achieve their own kind of aims. So that's why we study these historical texts, because you realize working with non-state actors, positioning your military in a particular way, establishing logistic supply chains, thinking about deterrence, right? Deterring an adversary, as actually a timeless principle. And that has three components, which is three C's of deterrence: credibility, capability, and communication. Where if you want to deter an adversary from attacking you or take over your prized area, whatever that is, or not attack you, then when you threaten them, you need to have a credibility of your threat that, look, hey, if you touch us, if you attack us, if you touch this aspect of what we do, we will respond, right? And that threat has to have credibility. And then the second C is that it has to have capability to underwrite it. Like if you're threatening to respond to somebody or a foreign state, or another company, you need to be able to have those capabilities in place to send your jets, to send your aircraft carriers, or to hurt them through legal means, and etc. And then communication, and you need to find a way to communicate that threat, so that it can have credibility, so that actually when you use that threat, that people would know when you communicate it with the right channel, with the right wording, people know that actually we shouldn't touch that country. Or if another country crosses the red line for that country, there will be consequences, and they do have the means to respond to that. But even those, right, deterrence, this is deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial, where you are deterring an adversary from even coming close to your seas or to your land or to your interests by fortifications, by complex legal systems, by alliances. So you're making it impossible for that adversary to even come close to attacking you, rather than just also threatening them by, if you do, you're able to attack me, but there will be a big price for you. That's deterrence by punishment. Even the deterrence by denial, and those two types of deterrence are visible in all across these historical texts, and they are still utilized today. So that's why we go back to, as I said at the start of this kind of initial recording, the initial kind of comments I made in this recording, that we're going back to a Clausewitz kind of language on characteral war versus natural war. In other words, there are certain things in leadership, in global challenges, in formulation of policy, whether you're in government, whether in your private sector, whether you're in defense and security or foreign policy or economy or trade, um, that actually they are timeless. But there are also certain things, character, of the context that we live in, information, new technologies, opportunities, complexities, they differ, they change. But looking at history, reading some of this text and understanding how they were trying to respond to those challenges in their time helps us to kind of learn about how you could respond to a challenge, how you can formulate a strategy to achieve the policy aim that you want to achieve.